And we're back with part two. I remember the hugging witch that's outside the shack being a huge problem in those early days, mainly because I was messing up on the timing to not be grabbed. But after a couple of tries and grabbing the Estus shard, I did a bunch of exploring afterwards, and the order of that went something like this. First, I was able to free the Pyromancy NPC and send him back to Firelink. I then made my way to that one valley that had that conga line of enemies, which, surprise, surprise, had one of the hugging witches, so I was super cautious with trying to take them all on, which, worked out for me mainly because I was able to just kind of take my time and take them out kind of systematically so that I wasn't in such a big, mob situation. I then made my way up the hill to enter the place where the cursed, rotted Greatwood boss was. Now, I remember at the time, looking at a giant open space with a tree at the end and thinking to myself, it kind of seems like a boss area. So that's when I immediately turned around and made my way over to the tower that was home to the Onion Knight. I went down the elevator at first, got killed by the ice guy at the bottom. So, I spawned back in and the night was gone. Meaning that I lucked into finding out, the whole elevator puzzle that, he sends you up to go meet with Sigward as well as like the giant archer, which worked out tremendously for me because when I was exploring the one patch where like the giant should be firing arrows later on, I didn't have to face any of that because I had previously met him. So, you know, worked out for me. I did all the Sigward stuff that I could, but then I ended up getting stuck on how to actually get back to the main area. So that's when I had to look up, one, how to do that, but what was more important is that I discovered the existence of the Chloranthy ring, which became an instant staple for character creation for me throughout the rest of the games. I mean, I want to say every single character that I've played in every game that has rings included some version of the Chloranthy ring, or and over time, the upgraded versions of those rings. So it was a great discovery then. I trudged through the rest of the areas, including that underground sewer place that had like the giant rats, and then I ended up, doing the whole quest line with the priestess steward and finding the priestess, getting her out of the jail, and then, sending them both on their way to Firelink so that I could interact with them later. But after that, I ended up hightailing it past the ice guy and got the bonfire on the other side for the road of sacrifice. But I didn't move past that because I knew I had to take on the boss that had been sitting for me for the last couple hours, that being the cursed rotted Greatwood. Needless to say, the boss has its difficulties, but most of them early on for me was just mainly getting distracted on the smaller guys that end up spotting in the arena rather than actually going up and solely facing the boss. Once I broke that habit, I eventually started to notice that attacking the fleshy bulbs that appear on him made him take more damage. So I started mainly targeting those, and that's when I was starting to consistently get into the second phase of his fight. One of those things that really annoy me about these kinds of games is when the enemy starts to like change the environment around him. And in this case, that meant, that like what I assume is the acid ring that would appear around him occasionally. I wasn't a huge fan of that mechanic, mainly because it just seemed to just like restrict access to him, which, I understand that's difficulty, but it's not, it's just like, okay, I just get to hang back for a couple minutes and then, okay, now I can attack him. It just kind of unnecessarily slowed down the fight, in my opinion, and it wasn't like, very exciting. So I wasn't a huge fan of that. But, I was quickly able to adapt, and that's when I was finally able to take him out. Now, before I start talking about the actual rankings, I looked back at my other video and I realized that I never actually explained this spectrum of unique versus annoyance. So, For me, it went a little something like this. Those that were ranked higher, those were getting, ranking first and second and third, tend to have abilities that are more unique and are better able to be somewhat fun versus like some of those like abilities where it's just like it's really cheap. It's like they rely on one ability and it's just like a foolproof kind of thing where it's just like, oh, it just makes the a boss a slog, or it just like keeps them at bay. It just like unnecessarily slows down the fight, and it was just like it's those kinds of abilities that are just like artificially annoying. That might be different for some people, but for me, it was mostly like things like with the curse rotted great wood, where it's like you have that ring of acid where you just have to kind of wait for it to disappear so that you can begin attacking it. For me, it's just like it just unnecessarily puts like a time hamper on the fight, and it's just like, okay, I gotta wait now, and for me, that's more of an annoying kind of ability rather than something that's like genuinely unique. But for the rankings overall, the Cursed Rotted Greatwood came in 22nd overall. Now, the reason rather for why this happened, I would say, is again, it had a very low unique annoying score. I thought that the acid rings and the giant hand were just kind of really annoying mechanics, and they weren't like super exciting or anything. So that really dropped it down. The aesthetics, in addition, weren't that great because it was a giant tree. It's not really that interesting. It's a lot of gray. Same with gun deer, or I guess in this case it's brown, but same sort of idea. The soul reward wasn't that great. I mean, granted, you get the kill that you give to the NPC, but you kind of need that to make all of the other bosses' souls work. So it just kind of seemed like the stepping stone for greater things moving on. The difficulty, though, I would say was a little bit higher than some of the others, but not the best. But yeah, overall, I think 22nd is a pretty fair assessment for him specifically. Having already gotten the bonfire, I immediately went back to Firelink, gave the NPC the soul kiln so that he could do all the upgrading. Did all the upgrading that I could for my weapons, and then I went back and started the road to sacrifice. I got to Henri, and from there, I ended up inadvertently following her quest line for quite a while. Because, I mean, apart from spending time fighting, giant crabs and then finding that one side path that had the twin blades in it, as well as the sharp gem that I used for my sword, I never actually saw the two bruiser type NPCs until I got stuck later on. So, somehow I had made my way almost directly to the Crystal Sage fight. The Crystal Sage ended up coming in 20th overall. Now, why is that for this case? The aesthetic of his abilities, I don't know if it's a he or a she, but the aesthetic of their abilities, I guess, I liked them. I liked the fact that they were crystal. I hadn't seen any other kinds of magic at the time, so it looked pretty cool, just having a bunch of like crystal beams getting shot at you. But after that, it started going downhill. I mean, the design, yeah, I mean, it's just like your standard, like, sage witch type kind of deal. The soul reward, yeah, it wasn't that great. I never really used the spell. But I did end up using the rapier for farming, but outside of that, I never really used it in actual combat. The unique annoying scale, that one ended up worse than the Cur's Rotted Wood, mainly because of the one part of the fight where it's like, oh, I'm gonna spawn 8 different versions of myself and then shoot crystal beams at you, where you have to kind of meticulously go and figure out which one is the correct boss. And it just ended up, same sort of deal, sort of inflating the time you spent fighting the boss. And it was just like, okay, this isn't as fun. And that's why they ended up with not a good score in that. And the difficulty outside of that, the difficulty, because it's like, oh, it was one hit to take out your clones. It wasn't super hard of a fight. So, overall, I think 20th ends up being the correct score. I continued on just like everybody would in that situation. You go through all the NPCs and all the dogs, but you eventually, fight your way through all of that, and you make your way up to the entry point with the chapel. Almost immediately, of course, I talked to the one guy who's just like prostrating himself on the ground in front of the chapel, cleansing shrine place, and I almost immediately get sucked into the DLC. Now, the only reason I didn't go further into the icy tundra is because of the one little call sign that says something to the effect of, "Oh, it's too hard unless you fight the princes." So from there, I went back to the chapel. But of course, almost starting a DLC seems like a nice wrapping point, mainly because in the next video, I just want to cover the entirety of the Cathedral of the Deep and probably the first big boss fight of the game, that being the Farron Legion. So look out for that. And from there, take care.